Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Fantasy Fellowship Q&A session. My name is Max, and with me is Erin. We're joined today by award-winning author Ken Liu, known for both his genre-defying epic, The Dandelion Dynasty, and his multiple award-winning short stories. In fact, his short story, The Paper Menagerie, was the first work of fiction to win both Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. His work has been translated into more than a dozen languages and are known for bringing together questions of history, technology, and morality in thought-provoking and meaningful ways. Ken has also ventured into the Star Wars universe, writing The Legends of Luke Skywalker, and his work has been adapted for the screen, most recently in AMC Plus's series Pantheon, which debuted earlier this year.
Ken has been a very popular author with the Fantasy Fellowship members. There have been 2 separate buddy reads for his work this year, beginning with the Paper Menagerie. The amount of tears that were shed by Fellowship members over that short story collection was truly impressive. Most recently, a number of us have read the Dandelion Dynasty and were dazzled by the depths of the stories contained in that series. His works are regular recommendations for people interested in political fantasy and science fiction, and we could not be more excited to get to speak with him today. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you so much, Erin and Max, and thank you for having me, Fantasy Fellowship. I'm super excited to talk with all of you. The questions that you send in are awesome, so I'm really looking forward to this chat.
Great. Why don't we just start off just getting a bit of background on you, because you have quite a colorful past in terms of the things you've studied and the jobs you've
That's a nice way to put it.
Becoming a writer.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. The other way is you seem very aimless in life, but anyway. Okay, so here's why I say that. I don't have a really typical career path for somebody who knows what they're doing. I don't seem to know what I'm doing if you look at my resume. I started out as a software engineer, and I spent years working for Microsoft and also for a startup. And then I went to law school and became a corporate lawyer and practiced for a number of years. And then I moved over to doing litigation consulting, where I testify as a expert witness in high technology cases, patent, trade secrets, copyright, etc. And then finally, I went full-time as a writer about 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember exactly how long. Throughout that entire time period, I was also writing and publishing. So, somebody who has no idea what I'm doing might observe this trail and say, you don't seem to know what you're doing. And I would say you're probably right. I don't think any of us really knows what we're doing. But, I'm in the business of writing. And so one of the things I've noticed is that humans are very good at coming up with patterns and retrospectively explain their life story, their arc. It's actually one of my central conceits that I think in some ways Dickens was much wiser than people give him credit for, in that he was one of the first authors that I'm aware of who came up with the theory that feels very modern, which is the idea that we narrate ourselves into being, that our lives make sense only in retrospect as a story that we tell. We live life as a series of random events, really, one after another, but then we cannot make sense of it that way. We have to retroactively go back and attribute causes to effects and come up with a character arc for ourselves. It's why fiction is so interesting to us, because we are arguably always rewriting our own lives as fiction. So in that vein, I could say that, in fact, there is a direction to my life in the sense that all of the professions I've engaged in involve storytelling in one way or another. Being a lawyer is very much about storytelling. My interest was in constitutional law and the idea that a society must have some sort of constitution, some set of constitutive ideas and deeds that form the core being of that society, and that generation after generation we reinterpret those events and give them new meaning, and that is all that is meant by a culture. A culture is simply a set of stories handed down from generation to generation, and each generation giving it a new interpretation. Without that, you have nothing. And so that's kind of how I think law and storytelling are actually related. And as a software engineer and as a technologist, I still do quite a bit of that right now. As a technologist traveling around the world talking about futurism and related aspects. But the way I approach programming and approach technology is largely from the perspective of an artisan and an artist. I think technology is much more of a craft than it is a science. It's much more about art, about speaking about art. And so I think of technology very much the same way I think about poetry or about any sort of endeavor that involves the expressive nature of humanity. I think of technology as one of the many ways in which we speak about who we are to the universe. It's just a very physical manifestation of that speaking. Every technology that you can think of is really a tangible manifestation of a mental pattern. So it is as though when you're looking at technology, you're really looking at human beings' minds made tangible, which is, a wonderful way to think about it. And it's a story that we tell when we build technology, whether it's as individual inventors or as makers, as even as critics and users. We are using those tools to express who we are, to tell the story of who we are. So one way to make sense of my life is that I'm searching and jumping between different mediums for storytelling and trying to figure out what is the best way to tell the story that I want to tell. So that's how I make sense of it.
Well, that's really fascinating, and actually that leads very well into like the first real question we have for you. You talk about tools and the tools that we use to interpret the world around us. By training, you're an attorney. The American legal system is known for trying to teach us how to see the world and how to interpret it around us. Have you brought any of that training into your work as an author?
Undoubtedly. I mean, there are very explicit aspects where that's true. I mean, if you take a look at my first collection, my first collection, the Paper Menagerie and other stories, multiple stories deal with legal issues or feature legal interpretation as a core aspect. So the Man Who Ended History is very much about what does it mean even when we talk about justice in the context of international law? Is there even such a thing as international law? What the hell is it? What are war crimes, really? And it's about history, but it's also very much about the idea that there is something called law that we argue over and that we make it into a reality. I mean, if you think about it, law is a very weird invention. We place artificial constraints on what we can do. We refrain from doing things we can otherwise do because of a set of ideas we have about who should be able to use force, who should have power, what are false things that we want to make real. I mean, if you think about it, all rights, and this is obviously very basic to anybody training in the American legal system, especially since the advent of legal realism, we don't really, rights, privileges, duties, these are all non-existent things. They're not real in the physical sense. They are mental constructs that we have given reality. They are, in fact, technologies. And I think a lot about law and constitution and what they mean in terms of who we are. How does a society tell its own story through its laws? How does a society constitute itself via these legal acts? So, The Man Who Ended History is one of those stories that explores that, but also there's All the Flavors, which is also a story very much about the legal status of Americans who are of Chinese descent. And I phrase that deliberately because it turns out that, a lot of my interest is in the way we label things, how we label things, and how we interpret things. I found it very interesting, for example, that the story of All the Flavors, when people describe what it is, people say, "Oh, it's about a bunch of Chinese miners in America." Actually, no, it's not. It's nothing like that. The story is about a bunch of miners in Idaho. That is true, but all of the miners are American, or all of them are not American, depending on how you want to view it. The white miners are no more and no less American than the Chinese miners there. So what I would say, that's why I phrase it as a bunch of American miners of Chinese descent. It's about their status, and I've had to sort of do that repeatedly, because I think the way we phrase things and the way we position ourselves legally vis-a-vis the other people is a very important part of how we see the world, and a very important part of what we default into in terms of the stories we want to tell ourselves. Anyway, so, as far as legal training is concerned, obviously they make very explicit appearances in the stories, but also there are very subtle ways in which they matter. One of the things I learned as a lawyer is that the legal system is really not, it's not really about the pursuit of the truth, especially in the criminal justice system. We think it is, but it's really not. The law and economics people will say, well, it's about pursuing the most efficient way. It's figuring out which party is the most efficient party to bear risk, which is, to me, a very brutal but also honest way of thinking about it. I think there's another way to look at it, which is the legal system is very much about competing narratives. It's about which story, which vision of the world wins. So if you read, Supreme Court opinions, they often have at the beginning the section called recitation of facts, which is supposedly a dry listing of the facts in the underlying dispute. But in fact, if you compare the recitation of facts at the beginning of the majority opinion versus the one at the beginning of the dissent, you'll see how the facts that are cited and the manner in which they're referred to really tell a story. And when you have understood the story that is in the minds of the justices who wrote those passages, you know what the reasoning is going to be. The story must support the reasoning. We often think that we reason based on abstract facts to a result, but I think it's far more common for all of us to rationalize the set of facts into a story that justify the outcome we want. And so the story really matters the most. It's the story is about your vision of human nature, your idea about what a society should be. What does it mean to have justice? What is fair? These are all actually emotional commitments. There's nothing abstract about them. You can't somehow reason out of vacuum into answers to these very difficult questions. They are based on very concrete experiences that you have as an individual human being, and then they're about the story you end up creating for yourself about what the world is like and what the world ought to be like. Mm-hmm. So that was actually a very important part of the legal training that ended up influencing my fiction. My fiction is often about the stories we tell ourselves and how that influences how we end up dealing with others. It plays into generational trauma, and it plays into injustice, it plays into prejudice, it plays into sacrifice. It's really, I like to say that, that we ultimately come into the world naked and ignorant, and we leave the world the same way. And in between, the only thing that we end up actually leaving behind us is just a story about who we are in the minds of those who know us. That is really the only thing we can leave behind. And in that way, our entire life is this effort of crafting a story that is satisfying to ourselves and that we try to tell other people and hope that they see our story the same way we see ours.
As someone who has also, go ahead.
I was going to go on to the next question. If you have a comment to make, Erin?
I was just going to say, as someone who has gone through the legal training and has sat through those Supreme Court opinions and the deciding opinion and the dissents, all of that rings very true. I had a professor who made it a habit to reach out to the attorney who originally argued the cases of Supreme Court cases at state court to find out which facts were left out of the recitation of facts in the Supreme Court opinions. And it was enlightening, and it changed the way that you saw the entire case and how you saw the interpretation and the decision made by the justices in the long run.
Absolutely, 100%.
Sorry, go ahead, Max.
So speaking of stories, you've spoken about your background, the different jobs you've had, and how they've influenced your work. But are there any authors or book series in particular that you felt have influenced your work or your writing style and methods?
Um, this is actually a much more difficult question to answer than it might seem at first. So we are influenced, obviously, in a multiplicity of ways, but I want to distinguish between negative influences and positive influences. So negative influences are situations where um, you're influenced because you read something that you found to be deeply not satisfying, and it influenced you to do something different. Now, it turns out that I think many of us are influenced far more strongly by negative influences than positive ones, in the sense that, at least for me, it's true. If something is really beautiful to me, I have no interest in copying it. It's very beautiful, and it's something that they've done. I mean, Dickens does Dickens well, better than anybody. I do not wish to write like Dickens. Why would I want to copy something that I admire so much? I'm going to end up doing something worse, and why do I care? So people sometimes tell me that, were you influenced by X, Y, Z? And I'm often surprised by it because uh, I think mostly people mean, did you copy that person? And the answer will be definitely not, because if I actually like what they do, I would have zero interest in copying what they do. Um, so having said all of that, it makes answering the question difficult because um, authors who talk a lot about negative influences don't tend to be very popular. No one likes to hear that negative energy, even if that actually is, in fact, what motivates a lot of it. So here's what I'm going to do. I will talk about books I've admired a great deal. And I will say that I didn't particularly copy them, but they did change the way I think about certain aspects of storytelling. So their influences in the sense that they changed the way I think about storytelling, not in the sense that they were models that I wanted to copy. So one particular story that did influence me a huge deal is Paradise Lost, which I think is particularly interesting because, you know, Milton is a very egotistical author. He's amazing. He goes in there and he just says, I'm going to tell you about the ways of God. I am a prophet. Here it is. But I love Paradise Lost. I thought it was incredibly wonderful, and it drove me nuts that the Romantics kept on misreading him. So everyone knows this thing that the Romantics say, Milton is of the devil's party and didn't know it, right? Because the idea is hell and Satan are written in with such exciting language. When you read the parts of Paradise Lost that are set in hell, you get all excited, and then the parts in heaven, it's just like, what do the angels do? They sing and they praise God. It's so boring. Um, and the Romantics say this is, a sign that Milton really belonged to the devil's party, and he just didn't know it. This is such a terrible reading of what he was doing. Milton was somebody who was trying to show you how easy it is to be seduced by sin. I mean, I'm hardly the first person to comment this. This is a reading that's most explicated by Stanley Fish in Surprised by Sin. But the idea here is Milton did write the hellish parts to be super exciting because they were modeled on classical epics. And the idea was that you as the reader would fall in love with Satan. You as the reader would find this exciting. You as the reader would say, oh my God, these rebel angels, they are so wonderful. And only then will you realize you have fallen into the same trap as Adam and Eve. You were seduced by sin. That is the whole point. Being in love with God and actually praising God is difficult. That is the whole point. To read it as the Romantics did, drives you nuts. I think it's a horrible reading. But the whole point of this is it made me realize that sometimes it is possible to write a book, a story that you really want to tell. And many people will misread it because they will read it according to the way they want. No matter how much you put in there to suggest that the opposite reading is actually what you want them to have, you have no control over that. It's if Milton can even be misread, then I don't feel so bad about myself being misread. So that's like one of those important influences for me, to come to terms with the idea that when you're writing a piece of fiction, you're going to have to be willing to live with the fact that other people will come to you, to your world, into your story, and make it fit their own story. We're all trying to tell our own stories. When I, write the story down, what I have left behind on the page is a set of words. And the story that was in my head is actually not on the page, because language is not capable of capturing the story that you really want. Language is incapable of capturing everything that you want to say. And readers will have to come into the work and then fill it with their own interpretations, their own stories, their own ideas about human nature, whether it's boring to serve God or not. They put that in there, and then they read the story on their own, and they come away with their own reading of your story. And here's the important thing: their reading is just as valid as yours within the context of their own reading. So as much as I dislike the romantic reading of Milton, it is entirely valid within the romantic viewpoint. So that's something that became very important to me, influential with me in some sense, because I ended up writing a lot of stories in which I have a particular interpretation that I wanted to convey, but I was perfectly happy with the fact that readers will not always come away with it, and that is just part of the nature of art, something that you have to live with.
Isn't one of the very first stories in Paper Menagerie is about its different species and how they record their stories, and one of them is you can get the intonations and emotion of the author.
Right.
Yeah, that's just what I was thinking as you were saying that the words that you're actually writing down are exactly what you
Yeah.
want to convey.
Yeah, that was something that Plato made a big deal out of. The idea that the Plato's idea was that writing was a terribly seductive, bad technology, because when you write something down and you read it, you think you understand it, when in fact you haven't, because you don't have a chance to interrogate the author. And real understanding has to emerge dynamically via a dialogue. That's why it's so important in the Platonic method to have a dialogue, because you cannot understand what the author really means unless you engage in this mutually influential and beneficial discussion to really get your minds to match. But writing, affords you none of that, and yet it gives you the illusion of understanding. So that was my little homage to Plato in that story. It is definitely one of my favorite stories that I ever wrote, and I still think about that story sometimes. It was a lot of fun to write. I hope it was fun to read too.
It was.
It was very fun to read. It was very thought provoking, a really strong opening to the collection, kind of gave you an idea of what was to come. And so talking about your short stories, do you have a favorite of all the ones that you've written? And how do you even begin going about choosing the stories to include in a collection like the Paper Menagerie or the Hidden Girl? Is that your choice? Is it something that you do with how the public has engaged with your stories? How does that happen?
I'm sure the answer will surprise no one, that it's yes to all of the above. So here's the thing. So let me tell you a little bit about how the Paper Menagerie and other stories came together. When it came time for me to put together my first collection, I wasn't really sure what to do. It's not something I've ever done before. I had no idea what you were supposed to do. My editor helped me out by saying that, look, here's what you do. You pick all the stories that have won awards, that have gotten good reviews, and you start with that. And then if you want to tweak on that somehow, go for it. And I was like, but the stories that other people like are not the same as the stories I like. And then, then the question becomes,
you had about what, 150 stories or something at this point?
I think so. At the time when the first collection came out, I don't remember exactly how many, something like that. Probably not 150. I honestly don't remember how many. But the question is, what is a collection for? Like, who is it for? Is it a collection for you to tell a story about who you are, or who you think you are as a writer? A kind of, is the point here to sort of tell a meta story about what kind of writer you are? Is that the point? Or is the point about trying to satisfy some abstract idea about what readers find satisfying in your stories. If readers have expressed via reviews and awards and other things what they prefer in your work, is it your job then to offer them that so that they get that in a neat, easy package? I didn't know the answer, and I still don't know the answer. I suspect that if you talk to authors, they're all going to have very different answers about this question. So I ended up just going with a huge compromise, if you will. I just let my editor pick the stories that he thought made sense. And then I took that and said, okay, let me just add a few more stories that I really like, that I never got any attention, but I really like them. I think they're very typical of me. So Erin, to your question, one of the stories that made it in that way is State Change. It's not a story that got much recognition. It's not a story that many readers got to read before I put it in the collection, but it's one of the stories I really like. It's a story I wrote at a workshop within 24 hours. And I really liked it because, it talked about all the things that matter to me, and it features Edna St. Vincent Millay, one of my favorite poets. So I was like, I have to have this story in because it's really important to me. So I put it in. And then I had some control over the sequence of the stories. So if you read the Paper Menagerie and other stories, my editor, Joe Monti, is responsible for most of the sequencing. I sort of was able to put in my input in the sense of structuring the collection so that it had three key stories to me that sort of set up the whole collection. So the first story is at the very beginning. It's the bookmaking habits of select species. I put that story out there because in some ways I felt it was a very Ken Liu kind of story. So I put it up there and I said, this story is divisive. There are many readers who enjoy it and many readers who have no idea what to do with this. They're like, this is not even a story. You have essentially a series of vignettes about alien species and what they think of as a book. There's no story here. It's not a story. So I said, I'll put that up front because this way, if you're in a bookstore and you're browsing, this is the first story you'll come to. If you're on Amazon, this is the story you'll see in the preview. You read it. If you click with that, chances are you'll like all the rest of the stories in the collection. If you don't like this, I think you should stay away because it will be a waste of your time and money to read this. So I put it up there, and this is, to me, the most honest way to approach readers, to filter out readers who would not click with you. And I'm a big believer that you should not waste the reader's time. So the earlier you can be your freaky self, the better. You put all of that out there, the most extreme version of yourself out there. If readers don't like that, they can save themselves time and save you the trouble of feeling bad about wasting someone's time. So that's the first story, and that's the story in the middle is the Events Reader's picture book of comparative cognition, which is a companion piece to the bookmaking habits. It's a very similar kind of story, except it actually has a narrative to it. It actually has an emotional narrative to it, and it's a meditation on what does it mean to even have consciousness. What does it mean to think? So I put that in the middle, and then the last story, "The Man Who Ended History," is the story I'm most proud of to have written up to that point. So I put it there at the very end because I wanted readers to leave with the story that I thought of as my most important story at the time. So that's how I decided on it. And in terms of favorite stories, those three plus State Change are probably my favorite stories, and they got in.
State Change really resonated with people during the buddy read. You could tell when people read certain bits of the collection because there would be sort of an influx of messages about that particular story, and State Change had a lot of those.
That's really cool.
So building on that last question just a bit, have there been any of the short stories that you've written then that have kind of surprised you with how they were received? Either they did a lot better than you expected, or they reached groups or audiences that you didn't expect, or in a way that you didn't expect?
I can't really say that's the case. I mean, maybe this says something about me, that when I write a story, I have no expectation for it. They're all so personal to me that I'm sort of amazed that anybody understands them. So if they get published, they get published, and if somebody actually says, "Oh, I really like this story," I'm super happy. So I have no expectation. So I would say if any story is read and people enjoyed it, it's a nice, pleasant surprise. And if a story didn't really make much of a splash or anything, it's not a surprise because I never intended any of them to make much of a splash. So I can't say that I was genuinely surprised. I feel like a lot of it just has to do with factors entirely outside of my control, and I can only control the things I can control, which is to write a story that I find satisfying and tell the story I want to tell. That's really all I can do.
Sorry, if there's a little noise outside. I apologize. I live on a main street. I apologize.
No worries. Go for it.
One of your most recent short stories, Byzantium Empathy, focused on cryptocurrency and virtual reality while giving us a really raw and tough story to deal with. What came first when you were putting the story together? Had you been wanting to tell a story that would explain blockchain and crypto to the masses, which it does very well?
No, that was not my intent. I really loved reading the Bitcoin paper, and actually, blockchain to me is a deeply interesting construct mathematically. I mean, the fact that blockchain works and it's a mathematical wonder. The fact that humans are smart enough to come up with this and make it work is just incredible to be like. Seeing these bits of technology or seeing things like I don't know, a video game, just the fact that such complicated things based on math being done at a really fast rate and work, and that something like that can evoke emotion and can create wealth and can change people's lives. To me, it really makes our species so amazing. I'm just always in awe of it. Anyway, I wanted to write that story largely because I was in awe of the whole blockchain concept and the math underlying it, and the idea that this solves the Byzantine general's problem, which is an incredibly difficult problem to solve without it. And I wanted to sort of convey that sense of excitement, that deep beauty in these mathematical ideas. But at the same time, I also wanted to, examine very critically the implications of blockchain and truly decentralized data structures. And if you really do have a world in which we have lost all faith in authorities and in institutions, and we wish to do everything through this sort of emergent consensus. The blockchain is in some ways direct democracy in the digital age. This is how it is. If we really did live in a world like that, what would it be like? What are the benefits? What are the negative aspects? And is this something that empowers the powerless, or does it actually strip power from them? My general answer is you can't answer these questions at the very high absolute level, because it depends. It always depends. And I just wanted to use this story to explore some scenarios in which it is one way versus the other, and hopefully get all of us to think a little bit about why some of us find blockchain so fascinating and what we think are the problems it solves, and and where it's lacking.
Yeah, I thought I'd understood about crypto and blockchain, and then when I read that story a couple of weeks ago, I was like, oh, turns out I didn't. It was a very good explanation that you gave. It was nice and simple and clear. So a lot of your works are kind of set or inspired by Chinese culture. So when you're writing, do you have like this sort of audience in mind, or are you trying to bring the aspects of Chinese culture to like a new audience, or is it more for readers with Chinese origins? And what sort of research would you do on the background of the history and culture when you're writing?
The question is interesting to me because it just shows how different, we can interpret the same set of events, the same set of actions in completely different light. I can say that I never thought of what I did in those terms at all. So I have a tendency to resist labels that are very abstract. So, for instance, I have a lot of friends who are from China and who are Chinese writers, and I've translated some of their work into English. And then people see this and they say, "Oh, you're translating Chinese science fiction," and that always throws me off because I don't know what Chinese science fiction is. It's one of those abstract categories that make no sense. You're saying science fiction written by authors who happen to use Chinese as their language of composition. Why is that even a category that makes any sense? I don't get it. It makes sense only insofar as you care about geopolitics and abstract identities and nations and nation states, as though those things matter. I happen to think they don't. So to me, I'm translating the work of Chen Qiufan, I'm translating the work of Hao Jingfang, and they're not in the same category. I don't know why people insist on wanting to put them in the same category. So because of that, when people say you're using aspects of Chinese culture, it's also weird to me because I don't know what that means. There are aspects of culture I care about. There are aspects of culture that are unique to me. So the way I would think about it is, I'm Ken Liu, I'm an American. So whatever I do by default becomes part of American culture because that's literally what the definition is. So when I'm writing about Unit 731, the war crimes of Unit 731, or when I'm writing about the judge traditions based in China, I'm not talking about them in terms of what they are in the abstract. I'm talking about very concretely in terms of how I see them, in terms of my own relationship to the world. So they become part of American culture. The reason I talk about these things is because I think American culture can, meaning the people around me, can use more engagement with these aspects of American history that we haven't thought about. What is America's involvement in World War II, especially in the Pacific Theater? What is America's relationship to the crimes of Unit 731? What is America's relationship to Americans of Chinese descent who have come into the country and who have made their own lives part of the culture of this country? So that's kind of how I think about it. And I also think about what are the ways in which I can change the direction of American culture? What are the ways in which I can develop my own story and tell my own story and describe my own vision for what it means to be an American and have that become part of the American chorus? So I don't think of them as about Chinese culture or whatever that means. I feel like writers who are Chinese and who are Chinese identifying can do that. I'm not interested in doing that. I'm interested in exploring American culture and the idea of what does it mean to be American in this new context. Insofar as many people seem to have a default vision of America as a white country and an American as a white person, then it seems incumbent on me to try to tell my own story, to make sure that I get my voice in there. Insofar as I go to a lot of international literary festivals, and I always make it clear to the audience that I'm here to represent America, and I'm trying to explain to you that insofar as you don't think that I'm American, that is exactly why I'm here, to correct that. The State Department helps American writers to go all around the world precisely to give a more complete picture of what American literary creation and what American culture in its full panoply of diversity and beauty is. So that's what I do. I tend to never participate in any kind of abstract movement about nation states and geopolitics and all this stuff. I'm very interested in, however, in participating in the collective story that I find myself part of, which is the story of the ongoing reinterpretation of the story of America and what does American constitutionalism actually mean. So all of my work should be understood in that context, I think. It's not about Chineseness, which is not something I'm particularly interested in or qualified to talk about, but it's very much about Americanness, and which I am qualified and very interested in talking about.
I think that's that's a fascinating way to look at it, especially about bringing in the alternate viewpoints and the additional information. I studied abroad in China for a year, and even 70 years after the end of World War II, the implications and the ramifications still rung out through history. And we were not in an area that had every part of China had involvement in World War II, but, we were not in an area that had a huge concentration of Japanese troops in the area or anything like that. And bringing that in has helped in so many ways to shape the way that I see things. And so as a reader, I personally really have appreciated that in your works and that expansion of what the facts are and the knowledge base that people can gain from that.
I think it's particularly interesting in that, I think here in the U.S. in particular, because we're, our national culture in some ways is very optimistic and forward-looking, and we have a tendency to view history as not relevant or something that we can easily forget, but it's not. If you think about the creation of the United States, not just as a story starting with 1776, but as a story starting with the very beginnings of the indigenous peoples and so on. America comes out of the confrontation and connection between multiple continents: Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And the implications of that history are still felt today. The halls of Montezuma, that you may think that was hundreds of years ago, but the consequences of that act are still felt today in the very real complexities of our relationship with all the myriads different traditions that make up the U.S. and also think about enslavement and genocide and all of these aspects of deep in our past, which still can be felt today. To say that you can just forget about that and move on is not possible, really. And a lot of my story is about figuring out how do we deal with this sort of historical trauma and generational memory? How do we allow these things to free us, to make us more of who we are, rather than to say, let's just forget about it, let's just move on? You can't actually move on. History is deeply embedded in who we are. The winners and losers of history, the implications last 10 generations and more. It's not something that you can just forget.
No, absolutely. So obviously you are someone who pulls from the world around you in a lot of ways. You are someone who pulls your own story and your own background into your works. How has that background and training been beneficial in some of your writing? For example, in your short stories, you have numerous uses of computer technologies in the Dandelion Dynasty. There are quite a few sections detailing the different machinery and engines and how they are built and how they work. Are these things you had previously researched, or are they things that you have built on existing knowledge, or how does that come about?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. I tend to think that the stories you tell are likely to be universal and resonant only insofar as they are true to your own personal experiences. Because, my belief is that you actually can't learn anything except things that you have really deeply experienced yourself. And the one saving grace of that is that it turns out that humans really have a lot more in common than they have in terms of differences. And so something that you have experienced deeply tend to be something that other people can also experience deeply. So that's why I write a lot of stories that are very much about deeply personal experiences, the experience that I have actually gone through. But I don't write autobiography. I guess that there's a distinction there. I think there's something, I personally don't feel comfortable turning actual events in my life into fiction, because in some ways that feels like a corruption of my own memory. So I've never written anything that is autobiography, but I do get inspired and take the emotions and experiences that I've had and try to turn them into fiction and make them into aspects of fictional stories so that I can see in some ways their universality, if you can make sense of that. So I'm someone, because of my technologist years, I have this deep love of the beauty of creating technology objects and things. Like there's a joy in making something that actually works, that does what you want it to do. And that to me is a really important part of what it means to be a human, that we enjoy making things. I think we don't emphasize enough how much pleasure we get out of making things. I mean, if you watch kids play, they love making things. They love making up games. They love making up building castles. They love making the turning a bunch of sticks and some rubber bands into a weapon. They love making things, right? And so that's what I want to do. I want to share that joy of making in my stories, and I talk about that. And so a lot of my stories do have a lot of technical parts, and sometimes I built them myself. When I was writing the Dandelion Dynasty, I was talking a lot about electrostatics, which is a type of electrical engineering that we don't really do a lot of anymore. But Ben Franklin did a lot of that. For example, he built these electrostatic motors that he even used one to help cook a turkey. It was sort of a turntable. It's very cool. And so my story, my novels used a lot of electrostatic engineering. And so I ended up reading a lot of those Ben Franklin's old papers and other papers from the time by people who explored it and the sort of things that they did. It was really wonderful. And I had to actually build some of these things for myself to see how they worked. And I do think you have to be careful about this stuff, because that stuff can be very dangerous. I mean, I shocked myself with some of these early capacitors just to see how they feel. In retrospect, that was very not smart. It hurt. And it turns out that I could have actually seriously injured myself. So don't do that. This is sort of like the Ben Franklin fly a kite into a storm experiment. People, I always wonder how many people try to repeat this. It's not a good idea. Do not do this. So anyway, I do sometimes build these things just because it is fun to build it, because you experience and you end up realizing that there's something about this that's just really wonderful. And also, along the same lines, I want to just say a few more words about this, which is I think sometimes we don't give people enough credit, right? We often write about something, or editors will say, well, this seems really, really particular to computer engineers. This seems really particular to Chinese culture or whatever. I don't think other readers will resonate. I think almost always that's just not the case. I mean, just think about your own experience reading about something that you thought you didn't understand. I think very quickly, once you understood some basics about the technical aspects, the pleasure of discovery of, people say, I don't read hard sci-fi because I don't understand it. Honestly, it's not about understanding the math. It's about understanding the emotions. And I think people can understand the emotions of discovery, of trying to figure something out. It's these are universal emotions. And I've never found some sort of cultural experience where there isn't some way for readers who are not of that culture to understand it once they've been given just some basics about what this is. I mean, we are all humans and we experience the same emotions. Sometimes we don't have the same names for them, but it doesn't mean we can't understand. So anyway, my feeling is people should just write whatever is unique to them, however they wish. And I think the universality comes from that particularity. The most universal is often the most particular and the most local and the most personal.
Wait, sorry, when you say you build them yourselves, when you're building an electrostatic motor, are we talking you're building like just a tiny model to test how things work, or you're building like
tiny model? I'm not gonna build the thing that can actually run So if
You're
I
not
were
cooking a
building,
turkey.
these are very tiny scale models. I'm not building a thing that will, shock a griffin out of the sky. Not doing that. Not doing that. Even I know that's not a smart idea. So no.
Fair enough. So speaking of Dandelion Dynasty, so there was a quite a gap publication. So the first one was 2015, then 2016, and there was a gap until about 2021, and then the last one just came out this summer. Was it difficult to return to the series after that gap, or were you trying to figure out the last two books in that whole time, or did your
Oh,
perspective on the entire series change if you took a break?
oh my gosh, this is so funny. It just makes me realize how different publishing looks from the outside versus from the inside, right? So from the outside, it seems like if the author finished the book, it would just come out within like a couple months. From the inside, you realize that is not at all how it works. Um, and the gap is really just an artifact of timing. So let me explain to you what happened. I had I had been working on nothing but the Dandelion Dynasty 90% of the time during the decade between 2012, 2010 actually, maybe 2012, I would say. Is it 2012? 2011 and 2021. During that decade, I practically worked on nothing but the Dandelion Dynasty. And I wrote a few short stories here and there, but the vast majority of my energy was devoted to nothing but writing that giant story. Here's what happened. The gap is here's what happened. Let me show you. So
Oh, you've got props.
these are the two books that make up the last two books in the series, The Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones. So you see them as two books. I wrote them like this. I wrote them as one. This is what I intended them to be. Okay. So
Okay.
so here's so how should I put it? Imagine me working on this book, which I thought was one book, because the contract I signed was for a trilogy. So this was the last book that I was going to be working on. I wrote the book and took years to write the book. And now I had to revise it. Each revision pass took more than a year. It takes more than a year to go from the beginning to the end and to revise this darn thing. And I had to go through it multiple times. So yes, I think you can imagine that I did not make the deadline for sending the book in because it was still being written. So I actually had, I met George R. R. Martin during this period of time, and I told him how upset I was that this book was not done and I wasn't meeting the deadline. And then you can imagine his response. He was just like, "Oh, go away, come and talk to me." So, anyway, but regardless, that's how I felt. I felt terrible that I was, not getting this book in, and it was a very long book, and I worked on it. It was very difficult. I got to tell you, it was very difficult to work on this book because, it's such a huge book. I felt in a lot of ways during a lot of that time. The vision I had in my head was I was one of those workers working on the Sphinx, right, which is this massive statue, humongous. I was over there chiseling somewhere on the cheeks, a little bit at a time. And all I can see was this little bit. Okay. I have no idea if the shape of the whole thing, does it even look crooked? Is the head too big? Is the tail too crooked? Are the cheeks smooth? Are the two cheeks even balanced? I have no idea. I mean, most of the time I was just like, oh my God, I have to revise this one chapter and solve this one problem. It's so frustrating to solve this one problem. I have to go back 1,000 pages earlier to change things and then search through the whole manuscript for all mentions of this thing. Every single day was like that. So painful. So I was ready to give up a lot of it. I mean, oh my God, talk about, being depressed. So when I finally finished it and I was like, this is done. It's actually done. I can't believe I actually finished it. I sent it to my editor And his response was, "We can't publish it." And I was like, "No, what do you mean?" And he's like, "Okay." He didn't hold up the books, but he was like, "Look at this thing you sent me. We cannot find a book like this. You want to put this book on the shelf for people to buy? How are we going to do that?" He was like, "We literally don't have the technology that will produce a book of that thickness at a reasonable price. So we're not doing it." So that's when we had to have this whole discussion about what to do. And that's why, the books were just chopped down the middle, literally. And that's why if you read the series and you get to the end of book 3, you're like, what is this? That's why, because they were written as one book. I tried to explain that in the intro. I said, look, these are meant to be one book. I'm sorry it had to be published this way, but please just try to read it as one book. I figure that, it would only be a problem during the gap of time between the third and fourth books, but eventually people will be able to get them at the same time and read it all the way through. So that's what happened. I went through a mini George R. Martin phase, if you will. That's the TLDR. But I did finish the book, so I got it out. Thank God.
That's amazing.
Was it difficult trying to convince after your editor looked at it, given that your deal was for a trilogy? Was it difficult getting that changed, or?
It was. My agent had to be involved and figure out what to do about this, because it's a big change. The contract was for 3 books, and now they can't publish it as 3 books. So that was complicated, but in the end we worked it out, and I was able to actually get the book out. So I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that the books are out and people. I can't tell you how happy I am really after the 4th book came out, because I got so many readers who told me that they finished it and now they're like, "Oh, now all the things you did in book 2 make sense." Like, I was like, "Yes, oh my God, it took 6 years, but finally you get it." Or sometimes it's like, "It took 10 years for you guys to see this." Yes. It really is kind of amazing though, because when I first started writing the saga, I knew what the last scene was going to be. So the very last scene of the final book, I actually knew that scene, but it took a decade, before that was out. And that was very satisfying to actually be able to conceive of this whole thing and to put it down and make it and shape it as well as I could so that I was happy with it, and to put it out there. And now to have readers actually, find their own homes in Dara, and then tell me about new discoveries they've made. I just today got an email from a reader who gave me a completely new interpretation of something in the books that I did not intend and hadn't thought of. And I was like, this is so cool. So, like I was telling you, once the books are out there, they're their own thing, and people will turn it into part of their own stories. And that's part of the joy for me, to find out these new readings that I hadn't ever imagined. But to see the books making sense for people in that way, it really is very cool. I had somebody who was in prison at the time that they read my book, and they told me about how the series gave them a lot of sense of hope, and managed to get them through some of the darkest parts of their lives. That was really very meaningful to me. So stuff like that makes being a writer really cool, that you get to do this and tell a story that readers resonate with and respond to. Anyway, so happy.
That's definitely something to be thrilled about.
Yes, made all of that suffering seem worth it.
I'm glad. Staying in the Dandelion Dynasty, which character was the most difficult for you to write, and why was that?
Probably, okay, there are 2 characters that are very difficult to write for me, I think. One of them is Jia, who is a character that is important throughout the 4 books. And her arc is probably the most interesting one, because even I don't think I'm spoiling anything. Even at the very end, I think people will disagree over her actions and how to interpret what she did. And I think that's why it's so fascinating to think about historical figures that are incredibly important, and to think about how they view their own actions versus what we think of them, and what the story they wanted to tell about themselves is, and versus the stories now we make up about them. I mean, that's one of the long meditations that I have in the series, which is this whole idea of history. So over and over again in the series, you will see some event being described, like Princess Kikomi, and you think it's just one episode, but she returns over and over again. You see that in the subsequent books. She becomes part of the constitution of Dara. People bring her up over and over again, then they reinterpret what she did. There's the feminist interpretation, and there's the very traditional interpretation, and there's the warlike interpretation, and then there's the scholars' interpretation, and everybody reinterprets what she did for their own purposes. And some of these interpretations are empowering, and some of these interpretations are not. And I find that whole process very fascinating, and Gia is one of them. I leave Gia at the end for the reader to interpret. Some interpretations of her life will be empowering, and some will not. Some will offer hope, and some will not. And I think that's what I want to get across: the idea that it is in the interpretation of stories that we create our own reality, and that's all there is to it. So that's one character, very difficult to write, just because I personally cannot think like that. I'm not able to do terrible things to accomplish whatever the goals are. It's hard. And the other character who is incredibly difficult to write is Kutenrovo, who is the leader of. Again, I don't think this spoils anything. She's the leader of the genocidal faction of the invaders. I have a lot of experience writing about war crimes and about genocidal leaders. So the Men Who Ended History is about people like this. But just because I have done a lot of research and thinking doesn't mean that I can somehow. So this is something that's very important to me. I think it's very important to empathize with everybody, including the villains. That is not the same thing, though, as sympathizing or forgiving. I think that's a very important thing, and people sometimes don't know the distinction. It is possible to empathize with terrible people. That is not the same thing as offering sympathy or excusing them or any of that. All that aside, writing a genocidal leader like Kutenrovo is incredibly difficult for me. It's just very hard to get into that sort of mindset, because I think as an author, you have to actually empathetically write all of your characters. Otherwise, they just don't come across as real, and you're not giving your reader your best. But writing a character like her was incredibly difficult and draining. It just brought up all these memories of the actual historical genocidal charismatic leaders who were like that. And we do have a tendency to somehow think a lot of these people are still great, which is ludicrous, but we do. So writing her was difficult, trying to get into her head and trying to portray her perspective empathetically, and trying to really convey what her thinking patterns were like, and giving people a sense of what that was like. So I found that very difficult.
You say that you feel that you can't commit terrible acts to accomplish your goals, but without wanting to go into too many spoilers or anything, Speaking Bones, the last Dandelion Dynasty book, it was quite brutal. Did you feel that you wanted to just hurt the readers a lot? Because there's a lot of loss and low moments in the series, but that entire last book until like the last 50, 100 pages is really grueling. Now that you've said that it was like the second part of one book, it makes a little bit more sense. But given that it just came out as one book, it was like just one solid mass of continual emotional blows.
Yeah, it is difficult. I mean, I don't know if I will say seriously that I have no intention of hurting readers, obviously. I do think it's important for me to tell a story that gives the readers a sense of my own difficult engagement with history, right? So Margaret Atwood said something very famous when she wrote The Handmaid's Tale, which is that all of the terrible things and atrocities committed in that book, she said, she didn't make any of it up. All of it was based on something that happened somewhere, sometime. She was very clear about that. These are all real things that people did to women. I am not making any of this up. So I will say the same thing. All of the atrocities committed by the invaders in Speaking Bones and Veiled Throne were based on historical events that actually happened. Some of them may have been cleaned up a little bit so that they're more palatable because the history was actually worse. I actually couldn't, as a parent, there are some things that the Mongols did to children that I cannot actually write, even fictionally. I just can't do it. There are some things that the Japanese imperial troops did to civilians in Asia that I could not actually write, even fictionally. So, but whatever is actually in these books are based on historical analogs and actual things that people did. What I wanted to really convey is that we are a terrible species. We are actually a very terrible species. It doesn't mean that we're hopeless, though. I just don't believe that. I think that we are a terrible species and we keep on making the same mistakes, but it doesn't mean that we're hopeless. I have a slightly different take on the idea that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I don't think that's true. I think history is often repeated precisely by people who know history. There's a reason why people are drifting towards reading Thucydides again, because we're on the verge of another Cold War. And so people always go back to Thucydides whenever that happens. And they think somehow reading this history will give us guidance on what we should do. And I think that's what happens. We end up, history really is just one random thing happening after another, and then we go back and make up stories that explain what happened. And we have a tendency to think that the stories that we tell are the same thing as the truth, and that a story that was told in the past will inevitably be retold again because nothing ever changes. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we should think that way. I think if you think that way, then you never actively try to stop and try to make anything better. If you think that human nature is always the same and that we are doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again, then there will be no stop to generational trauma. There will never be any way for you to not do the same terrible things that were done to you. And I think intuitively we know that is not true. I think all of us try. We don't always succeed, but we try to not do the same terrible things to our children that our parents did to us. We try to be better than the suffering that were, inflicted on us. And I believe there's hope in that. We try. We don't always succeed. I'll be the first to admit that we don't always succeed, but we try. And in that trying, there is always hope.
Yeah. One last thing. We've been getting a lot from the different authors we've been chatting to. Do you have any book recommendations for any of our members? Any in particular that you feel?
I do. I have a recommendation that's a little bit of a surprise. It's okay. Let me think.
The Dandelion Dynasty.
No, no. I have two recommendations. One is fiction and the other is nonfiction. So the nonfiction recommendation is Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. Lulu Miller is a reporter with NPR, I believe. I believe she's a science reporter. And Why Fish Don't Exist is a very difficult book to describe, but it's wonderful. It's part autobiography, it's part biography, it's part of history of science, it's part meditation on philosophy, it's part actual biology. And essentially, Lulu Miller tackles the question of, there's this whole concept we have of fish. And in fact, a great scientist, the first president of Stanford University, was one of the biologists who really defined the study of fish as a subject. And so Lulu Miller then goes on this multi-year quest to understand who he was and how he ended up being who he was. And then it ends up being a really interesting story about how scientific categories are unstable, and how the names we give things end up shaping how we think about them, and how the pursuit of order in the middle of chaos is something that we humans have been engaged in for forever. And it's also about her own loss of her own crisis of faith. And it ended up being a very resonant story with me because it's about storytelling. It's about who has the right to tell whose stories. When we write a biography of someone, what are we doing really? Are we taking someone's story away from them, or are we just adding to that story? Like, is it even possible to tell a story without in some ways stealing some essential part from the people you're telling the story about? Anyway, just very deep, interesting things that I really enjoy thinking about, and I still puzzle over, and really profoundly changed the way I think about storytelling. So I strongly recommend it if you have any kind of interest in the history of science and in philosophy and in storytelling and in the history of Stanford University, even that, and also the biology of fishes. I definitely recommend the book, Lulu Miller, Why Fish Don't Exist. So that's the nonfiction book. And the fiction recommendation is by Kate Elliott. And it's a novella coming out of Tor.com called Servant Mage. It's a fantasy, it's an epic fantasy, but only a novella, which is, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it's Kate Elliott pulls it off. Kate Elliott is known for writing massive, massive tomes and series. And the Dandelion Dynasty is like a tiny minnow compared to the giant stories that she tells. And she does it over and over again. So she's a true master at this. But here she accomplishes the impossible. She manages to tell an epic story in a novella. And it's about revolutions. It's about anti-colonialism. It's about how do you find a way to survive in the middle of titanic struggles of elites who care nothing about your own survival. And it's an exciting adventure story. It's about a woman who has who has the most amazing sense of her own place in the universe, and it's got a great magic system that I still think a lot about. I think that's key to the success of a great magic system. It's one where you can sort of imagine yourself using and sort of picturing yourself as a fanfic character. I love it. Anyway, so Servant Mage by Kate Elliott. That's my fiction recommendation. An amazing book, and especially it's a novella, so you can read it in one afternoon, and then you'll know if you love her stuff. And if you haven't read her before, oh my God, this will bring you on to her stuff.
Great, both of those sound good. Actually, yeah, when people join our Discord, we usually do like a little intro quiz for them, and one of the very standard questions is, if you could steal the powers or knowledge of one literary character, who would it be, and what's the first thing you would do? And everyone goes for, I want magic, I want to be able to fly, I want
Exactly.
Stephen Sanderson. Yeah. You do get the people like, I want Harry Potter, or I want Gandalf, I want to be Gandalf. It's like, it's such a cop out of an answer though. It's just I just want blanket magic.
Yeah, this is the I want more wishes wish.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And why don't fish exist also sounds pretty fascinating.
I also recommend that if your recipient enjoys audiobooks, try to get them the audiobook, because Lulu Miller herself does the narration,
Oh,
and
nice.
she is, she's an NPR reporter, so she has a great voice, and you really get her intonation and how she wanted the story to be read. It's very cool.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The taxonomy is I did taxonomy at university, and it is a completely changing field all the time.
Yes.
Especially in marine organisms, which have gone from
Yes.
this, like mollusks. This has a shell. This has a shell.
Yep.
Put them in the same class, and then now we have DNA sequencing and things, and it turns out, okay, actually, this entire tree is completely wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that it's fascinating, and Lulu goes into a great deal of detail about how that applies to fish as a category, and apparently there's a very good argument that fish as a category is not real, in the same sense that, okay, birds as a category is real. Like if you talk about birds, there's a biological basis to say these things are birds and these things are not birds. It turns out there is no such thing for fish. You cannot actually say something definitely is a fish or not, which is wild to me. So anyway.
Wow. Thoughts that will now keep me up at night. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why it's like, why fish don't exist. I did think about that. I'm like, why fish don't exist? Wow. Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, I think that's been a little over an hour, and I think we've gotten through most of the questions that we aim to get through. Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. This has been a really fascinating and great conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Erin, Matt.
Thank you. So for those of you watching, if you want more information about Ken and his work, you can find that on his website, kenliu.name, which is also where you can sign up to his newsletter, which is the best way to find out about his new works and what he's up to, including short stories to come in 2023. His TV show Pantheon, based on a trilogy of his short stories, is out now on AMC+, and the conclusion of the Dandelion Dynasty, Speaking Bones, is out in paperback in the US and the UK this January.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, please come check us out on social media. We can be found on Twitter at Fan Fellowship, on Instagram at fantasy_fellowship, and of course on Discord under Fantasy Fellowship. We also have a website, fantasy-fellowship.co.uk, where you can learn more about who we are as a book club and what we do. Please like and subscribe below. We have even more exciting plans in the works, and we wouldn't want you to miss those. Thank you.
Thank you.